There's been an escalation in tensions between the United States and China. Washington has abruptly ordered Beijing to close its consulate in Houston, and the move has brought swift condemnation from China and a threat of retaliation. In a moment, live to our correspondents covering both sides of the story. But first, here's how things unfolded in Texas.
It began with a blaze. Firefighters were seen outside the Chinese consulate in the U.S. city of Houston after reports of a fire inside the compound. There were reports of people burning documents and papers, and through the smoke, clarity. Hours later, China said the U.S. had ordered the closure of the consulate, an allegation eventually confirmed by Washington. America says it's aimed at safeguarding its intellectual property and the private information of its people. But China has lashed out at the move. It's called it a political provocation that violates international law.
严重违反中美领事条约的有关规定，蓄意破坏中美关系，十分蛮横无理，中方对此予以强烈谴责。中方敦促美方立即撤销有关错误决定，否则中方必将作出正当和必要反应。
The incident adds fuel to an already strained relationship between Washington and Beijing. Both sides have repeatedly clashed on several issues, like trade, 5G, and even responsibility for the COVID-19 pandemic.
Now, for more on this, Simon Marks joins us from the US Capitol. Simon, first up, the fire at the consulate. What do we know about it, especially when we consider the reports of people seen burning papers on the grounds?
Yeah, I mean, it seems very clear, Steve, from the video that was captured by people who live in close proximity to the consulate in Houston, that an effort was being made by people within the building to go up onto the roof, put papers into barrels and start burning them. Now, we've seen that kind of behavior before, not by the Chinese, but certainly by the Russians, most recently when Barack Obama ordered 2 Russian compounds here in the United States to close at very short order and ordered the expulsion of many of the diplomats and their families who used those 2 compounds. Then fires were seen inside the grounds of the buildings, and the assumption is that when something like this happens, it is diplomats getting rid of sensitive papers or even routine papers that they don't want to fall into the hands of the US authorities once those particular buildings and compounds are closed. Many American diplomatic compounds around the world actually have incinerators built inside them for precisely that kind of purpose. And so it seems highly likely, we don't know for certain, but it seems highly likely that having been told at very short notice that that consulate in Houston is now going to close, the employees inside the building started getting rid of documents and information that for whatever reason they did not want ultimately to fall into the hands of US intelligence agencies.
All right, Simon, so how would the closing of the Chinese consulate in Houston serve to, as Washington says, protect American intellectual property and private data? Have the authorities elaborated on this?
They've not elaborated on it, but I think it's worth taking a look closely at what Morgan Ortagus, the US State Department spokeswoman, has said. She says that this consulate is being ordered to close, as you said, Glenda, to protect American intellectual property and Americans' private information. She said that the US will not tolerate Chinese violations of America's sovereignty and intimidation of our people. Now, if you put this into the most recent kind of historical context, this move against the consulate in Houston has been taken just a matter of hours after the US indicted 2 people that it claims are hackers inside China who had been trying to gain access to American information from biotech laboratories all over the country in a bid to understand America's progress in the development of a COVID-19 vaccine. That indictment says that those hackers were keeping a very close eye on American American media to understand which biotech firms were claiming that they were making progress on vaccines. Houston and the southwest of the United States is a big corridor for biotech. I mean, I'm not trying to join too many dots here, but there is that possibility. And also, I mean, certainly I can tell you reputationally, that Chinese consulate in Houston has been very active, particularly in the Houston community. It's a big international business community. It has boosted people-to-people contacts between the US and China over the last several years in a major way. And if the United States wanted to identify a consulate that it could order shut that was going to do damage to China diplomatically and to its reputation in the United States, certainly that consulate in Houston would be high on the list. But we'll have to see what officials here say over the next few hours.
Simon Marks from Washington, D.C. And now to Olivia Xiong, and she's covering China's responses. Olivia, so China has threatened to retaliate if the US does not revoke this decision. So what form of reactions can we expect?
Well, quite typical of these initial statements, China's foreign ministry has not spelled out how it exactly intends to retaliate with this latest U.S. move, although it did warn of firm countermeasures if the U.S. were to, quote, continue down this wrong path. Now, observers I spoke to say that one of the options that China has is to go for a tit-for-tat move, and that is perhaps to close down one of the U.S. consulate generals in China. There are 5 of them on the Chinese mainland, and according to a Reuters report, quoting a source that's familiar with this issue, it seems that China is considering closing down the U.S. consulate in Wuhan, although authorities have not confirmed this just yet. Now, the Global Times, a paper that's linked with the Communist Party of China, has also since opened a poll on Twitter asking people to vote for which U.S. consulate in China they think will be closed down. And its editor-in-chief has called this latest move a crazy move, not just because the Chinese consulate general in Houston is being asked to close, but also being asked to close very abruptly within 72 hours. He also had pointed out that this consulate general in Houston is the first Chinese consulate general in the U.S., so there is some symbolic significance there.
Olivia, this adds further strain to the relationship between the US and China, and we see that Beijing claims Washington has been making life hard for its people in the States.
That's right. That's the claim that China is making, and this comes as the diplomatic relationship is at an all-time low. We've seen China and the U.S. butt heads and trade sanctions towards each other over the last few weeks and months. Over various issues when it comes to trade, technology over the South China Sea, and the national security law in Hong Kong. Even as the U.S. has explained that it's doing this to protect American intellectual property, some Chinese commentators that have been quoted in Chinese media have said that they have linked this to the U.S. facing difficulties in getting its U.S. diplomats and their families back into China after they had been evacuated due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, media reports had earlier said that both sides could not agree on Chinese testing and quarantine procedures, and so that had led to a delay. And so this possibly is being seen as a retaliation for that. But China is no doubt painting this as an escalation in U.S. actions against China. The foreign ministry has also pushed back against U.S. claims of Sino-U.S. relations being unequal and there being interference. In particular, it accused the U.S. of imposing restrictions on Chinese diplomatic personnel in the U.S. It said that the U.S. had opened diplomatic mail without permission and that it had confiscated items that were meant for official use. The Foreign Ministry of China has also said that the U.S. has fanned hatred against China and that its embassy in the U.S. has received death and even bomb threats. And just a short while ago, we saw China issue a warning and ask its students in the U.S. to be on guard for arbitrary interrogations and detention. Now have a listen to what else the Foreign Ministry had to say.
一段时间以来，美国政府不断向中方甩锅推责，对中国进行污名化攻击， 无端攻击中国的社会制度，无理刁难中国驻美的外交领事人员，对中国在美的留学人员进行恐吓、盘查、没收个人电子设备，甚至是无端拘押。
And we were speaking with Olivia Xiong on the latest of US-China relations.